The text came in just after sunrise. No greeting, no hesitation, just a sentence that assumed compliance. Please don't come to the wedding. My husband doesn't want you there. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. I read the message slowly, then set my phone face down on the table. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. What I felt was something colder. Recognition. I am 65 years old. I've spent my life in finance, the kind where you don't react to noise, you respond to patterns. I built companies, exited them, and stepped back only after setting structures that ran without drama. Semi-retired doesn't mean absent. It means deliberate. And deliberate people notice leverage. For the past year, I had quietly paid for more than just a wedding venue. Deposits, vendors, travel, lodging for guests. Even the honeymoon fund that everyone kept praising as so thoughtful. I hadn't done it for credit. I did it because I believed family support was something you gave without keeping score. Apparently, I was wrong. The text wasn't apologetic, it wasn't conflicted, it was efficient, as if my role in their lives had already been reduced to an inconvenience that needed managing. I replied with a single word, "Understood." Then I finished my coffee. By mid-morning, I was at my desk reviewing accounts I hadn't expected to touch that week. Wedding funds were routed through a trust I controlled. Lifestyle support flowed through recurring transfers that I had authorized years earlier. Guarantees sat quietly behind the scenes, invisible until removed. They thought the wedding was paid for. It wasn't. It was pending my goodwill. I made 3 phone calls. Not emotional ones, professional ones. Freeze all discretionary disbursements, I said. Suspend outgoing transfers immediately. Flag any attempt to override and notify me. No speeches, no threats, just instructions. By noon, everything stopped. I didn't announce it, I didn't explain. I wanted the silence to arrive before the panic because silence tells the truth faster than arguments. It took 20 minutes. My phone vibrated once, then again, then didn't stop. Calls stacked on top of each other. Voicemails cut off mid-sentence. Messages from unknown numbers. Friends checking in. Relatives suddenly concerned. I counted later. 200 panicked calls. Not one asked how I felt. Not one acknowledged the text. They asked what happened to the funds. Why vendors were calling them. Why payments weren't clearing. Why things were suddenly on hold. I didn't answer. Because here's what they didn't understand yet. The text wasn't rude. It was instructive. They told me exactly where I stood. Tolerated financially, excluded personally. So I adjusted my position accordingly. That afternoon, another message arrived. This one longer, softer, confused. We didn't mean it like that. This is getting blown out of proportion. Can we talk? Talk. After the money stopped. I closed the message and stood up from my desk. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't shocked. I was done pretending that generosity without respect is anything but self-deception. They thought the wedding was the point. It wasn't. The wedding was just the moment they said out loud what they believed. That my presence was optional, but my money was not. They were wrong on one of those things, and by the time the sun went down, the calls hadn't slowed. They had multiplied, because panic, once it starts, doesn't look for fairness. It looks for reversal. And reversals only happen when someone believes they still have leverage. They didn't, not anymore. By the end of that day, I understood something clearly. This wasn't a family conflict. It was a correction. And once corrections begin, they don't stop just because someone suddenly regrets the numbers. By the second morning, the panic had changed shape. The first day had been noise, endless calls, overlapping voicemails, messages sent without punctuation or patience. Fear reacting on instinct. What came next was strategy. I could tell by the wording. Let's clear this up. There's been a misunderstanding. This is getting out of hand. Not one message mentioned the text. Not one acknowledged why the funds had frozen in the first place. They spoke as if the problem had appeared on its own, like a storm no one had seen coming. I didn't respond. Silence is uncomfortable for people who believe access is guaranteed. It forces them to sit with their assumptions, and most people don't like what surfaces when they do. Late that afternoon, I received a call from a number I recognized. Not family, not a friend, but someone who handled logistics. Vendors had questions. Payments that were supposed to clear had stalled. Deposits that had been confirmed were suddenly under review. I confirmed nothing. All disbursements are paused, I said calmly. That's intentional. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I see, the voice said carefully. They did see. That was the problem. By evening, the messages shifted again. Now there was concern for me. Are you okay? This seems extreme. Maybe you're under too much stress. That angle always comes next. When people can't regain control of a situation, they try to question the person holding it. I smiled when I read those. I wasn't stressed. I was focused. That night, I reviewed everything I had been covering quietly for years. It was more than the wedding. Much more. Monthly shortfalls disguised as timing issues. Credit extensions justified as temporary. A lifestyle that looked independent on the surface and borrowed stability underneath. They hadn't been planning a future. They had been assuming one. The next morning, I finally received a message that came close to honesty. He didn't mean it personally. He just didn't want tension at the wedding. I read it twice. If my presence created tension, my absence would remove it. That had been their logic, so I applied it consistently. By midday, my phone rang again. This time I answered. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled, trying not to crack. "This has gone far enough," they said. "We need to fix this." "We?" I asked. There was a pause. "You know what I mean," the voice replied. "No," I said. "I don't." Another pause, longer this time. "You can't just pull everything," they said. "People are counting on this." "You told me not to come to the wedding," I replied evenly. I respected that. Everything else followed. "That wasn't supposed to cost us everything," the voice shot back. I let the silence stretch before responding. "Then you misunderstood the arrangement," I said. "Support without respect is still support. Once respect is removed, so is the support." The call ended shortly after that. Not angrily, abruptly. By late afternoon, the pressure came from a different direction. Family. Carefully worded messages, neutral voices, people asking me to consider the timing, to separate emotions from finances, to be the bigger person. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Because explanations invite negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating. That evening, another message arrived. This one longer, apologetic in tone but vague in substance. It expressed regret for how things came across and suggested we meet after the wedding to reset. After the wedding. I almost laughed. They still believed this was temporary. That once the event passed, everything would return to normal. That money could be paused and restarted like a streaming subscription. They didn't understand that systems don't work that way. Once a freeze is justified, reversing it without addressing the cause turns a boundary into a bluff. And I don't bluff. That night I slept deeply. Not because things were resolved, but because they were no longer uncertain. The rules were clear now, even if they refused to acknowledge them. They had made a decision and communicated it clearly. I had responded in kind. By the time I turned off the lights, I knew the next step wouldn't be panic or politeness. It would be escalation. Because when people realize money isn't coming back easily, they stop asking nicely and start looking for pressure points. And when they do that, they usually reveal exactly who they are. That's when things get interesting. The escalation came quietly. No threats, no shouting, no dramatic ultimatums. Just a shift in tone that anyone who's worked around money long enough learns to recognize. Entitlement turning into offense. The first sign was an email forwarded to me by my legal advisor. It wasn't sent to me directly. That mattered. People rarely loop you in when they're confident. They do it when they're building a record. The language was careful, concerned, framed as responsibility. They were questioning whether freezing the funds was reasonable given the circumstances. They cited stress, family tension, my age. The implication sat just beneath the surface, never stated outright. That implication irritated me more than the text ever had. I called my advisor and asked a single question. "Is anything I've done improper?" He didn't hesitate. "No, it's clean, documented, justified." "Good," I said. Then we let the paper trail speak. That afternoon my phone rang again. This time it was my daughter. Her voice sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced the opening line more than once. "Dad," she said softly, "can we please talk?" "We're talking," I replied. She took a breath. This has spiraled. Vendors are calling. People are confused. Everyone's upset. I waited. You didn't have to do it this way, she continued. You could have told us first. I glanced at my phone, then back out the window. You told me not to come to the wedding, I said. You didn't warn me first either. That was different, she said quickly. It wasn't, I replied. It was clearer. She was quiet for a moment. Then defensively, you're punishing us. I shook my head. No, I'm responding to information. That text wasn't meant to push you out of our lives, she said. It was about avoiding drama. Then you should have avoided creating it, I said calmly. Her voice tightened. You're choosing money over family. No, I said. I'm choosing consistency over confusion. The call ended without resolution. Within an hour, the messages started again, but this time they were coordinated. Different numbers, similar phrasing, variations of the same appeal. He's under pressure. You know how he gets. Once the wedding is over, everything will calm down. I didn't respond. Because calm built on erasure isn't calm, it's submission. That evening I received a voicemail that finally said the quiet part out loud. We can't move forward like this, the voice said, strained. You're putting us in an impossible position. Impossible. I replayed that word twice. They weren't in an impossible position. They were in an unfamiliar one. They were experiencing life without a cushion they'd mistaken for entitlement. The next day, the calls slowed, but the pressure increased. A third party reached out. Someone with enough distance to sound neutral, but enough proximity to carry a message. They're worried this will damage relationships permanently, the voice said. That was decided when the text was sent, I replied. Well, they said cautiously. They didn't think you'd react like this. I smiled to myself. That sentence explained everything. They hadn't expected consequences. They'd assumed compliance. That afternoon, I received confirmation from my advisor that everything was secure. Funds frozen, accounts protected, no backdoors, no workarounds. The system was holding. What surprised me was how quickly the tone shifted again once that reality set in. The next message was shorter, quieter. We didn't think you'd actually go through with it. I read it once and set the phone down. That wasn't an apology. It was an admission. They believed my boundaries were theoretical, conditional, flexible. They believed respect was optional because money was reliable. That belief had shaped every interaction leading up to the text. And now, stripped of that belief, they were left scrambling. That night I slept without interruption, not because things were resolved, but because they were exposed. The wedding was approaching. The pressure was building. The reality was closing in. They were running out of angles. And when people exhaust persuasion, guilt, and concern, they usually reach for authority. That was coming next. I could feel it, because when entitlement fails, it doesn't retreat quietly. It escalates, and whatever they tried next would tell me exactly how far they were willing to go, and how little they had understood me all along. The authority play arrived 3 days later. It didn't come from them directly. It never does. When people think they can't win a conversation, they outsource pressure. My advisor called me mid-morning. They're questioning capacity, he said plainly. I didn't ask who. I already knew. The angle was subtle but unmistakable. Concern framed as responsibility. Questions about whether I was acting emotionally after a family conflict. Suggestions that maybe decisions of this magnitude should be reviewed or paused. Paused. That word tells you everything about intent. They want time, my advisor continued. Time to get the money flowing again. And after that? I asked. He didn't need to answer. I sat back in my chair and looked at the timeline laid out on my desk. The text message, the freeze, the calls, the pressure, the pivot to authority. It was textbook. When does this go anywhere? I asked. It doesn't, he said. There's no standing. Everything you've done is clean, documented, rational. Then we proceed, I said, quietly. By noon, an independent review was scheduled. Not because I needed it, but because transparency kills narratives faster than arguments. Every decision I'd made had a timestamp. Every action followed a written instruction sent to me. Not a phone call, not hearsay, a message. That afternoon, my phone rang again. I answered. This is getting out of control, the voice said immediately. No greeting, no softness, It stopped being under control when you told me not to attend the wedding, I replied. You're blowing that text out of proportion. No, I said calmly. I'm treating it as accurate. There was a sharp exhale on the other end. You know this could damage things permanently. Yes, I said. That was already decided. The silence that followed wasn't angry. It was scared. They tried one last appeal. This doesn't have to be like this, the voice said. You can reverse it. We can pretend it never happened. I leaned forward. Pretending it never happened is exactly what you expected me to do, I said. That's why the text was sent the way it was. Another pause, then quieter. We didn't think you'd actually enforce it. That sentence again. It followed them everywhere. I ended the call. That evening I received confirmation from my advisor. The review was complete. Findings were clean. No concerns, no irregularities, no hesitation. The authority angle collapsed before it ever gained traction. By the next morning, the pressure disappeared. No calls, no messages, no intermediaries. The silence this time was different. It wasn't strategic. It was resignation. The wedding date was close now. Vendors were demanding answers they couldn't give. Plans were unraveling faster than apologies could be drafted. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply continued living my life. Morning routines, work I enjoyed, evenings without tension. The constant hum of obligation that had followed me for years was gone. What struck me most was how quickly peace replaced it. They had mistaken my consistency for weakness. They had believed kindness meant compliance. They had assumed that because I stayed quiet, I wouldn't act. They were wrong on every count. The funds remained frozen, not as punishment, as alignment. The closer the wedding came, the fewer options they had left. And when options disappear, reality has a way of forcing decisions people have avoided for years. They were about to make one, and it wouldn't be the one they expected. The wedding day came without fanfare. At least not the kind they'd planned. I didn't attend. That much had been decided the moment the text arrived. What surprised me was how little it mattered once the day actually came. The anxiety I'd expected never showed up. There was no hollow feeling, no regret sitting in my chest, just distance. I heard what happened later, through people who didn't realize how carefully I listen. The venue downsized, decorations were simplified. Certain names quietly disappeared from the program. The minor changes they'd mentioned turned out to be cancellations layered on top of one another. When money stops moving, excuses run out fast. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Not calls this time. Messages, short, controlled, carefully worded. We're trying to make the best of today. This didn't have to happen. We wish you were here. None of them apologized for the text. None of them acknowledged why I wasn't there. I didn't reply, because acknowledging something after the consequences land isn't accountability. It's damage control. That evening, another message arrived, longer this time. Emotional. It spoke about family, about regret, about how things got out of hand. It hinted that once the wedding was over, we could talk like adults and put everything behind us. Put everything behind us. As if the problem was timing. As if the issue was stress. As if the text had never been sent. I turned my phone off and went for a walk. It was quiet outside. The kind of quiet that only exists when you're no longer anticipating the next demand. I realized I hadn't checked my phone compulsively all day. That habit had disappeared along with the obligation. The next morning, the aftermath arrived. The calls started again, but they were different now. Fewer. Slower. Weighted. The tone had changed from panic to survival. They weren't asking about reversing everything anymore. They were asking what it would take. Just some of it, one message said. Enough to get us through the next few weeks, another read. Weeks. They were finally thinking short-term because long-term had collapsed. I didn't respond. Instead, I met with my advisor again. We reviewed the full picture, what had stopped, what remained frozen, and what would happen if nothing changed. Can they recover? I asked. He didn't hesitate. Yes, but not the way they're used to. That answer satisfied me. I wasn't interested in ruin. I was interested in truth. That afternoon, a final call came through. I answered it. We know we messed up, the voice said quietly. No anger this time, no leverage, just exhaustion. I listened. We shouldn't have sent that text, they continued. We assumed things. Yes, I said, You did. A pause. We don't expect everything back, the voice said. We just need a way forward. I considered that. A way forward exists, I said. It just doesn't include my money. The line went quiet. Then softly, so that's it? That's honesty, I replied, for the first time. I ended the call. That night I sat alone at my desk and thought about how easily this could have gone differently. One honest conversation, one acknowledgement of respect, one moment of restraint, but none of that happened. What happened instead was clarity. They had chosen comfort over respect. They had mistaken generosity for obligation, and when that illusion broke, so did everything built on top of it. The funds stayed frozen, the distance remained, and for the first time I felt no urge to fix anything, because some situations don't need repair. They need recognition, and that recognition, once it arrives, doesn't ask permission to stay. By the time I turned off the lights, I knew the story was almost finished. Not because anything dramatic was left to happen, but because the lesson had already landed, and there was nothing left to negotiate. The ending didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with acceptance. The calls stopped first, then the messages, then the long gaps where nothing came through at all. That was how I knew they had finally understood the shape of the situation. Not emotionally. Practically, they had adjusted. Life has a way of doing that when support disappears. I heard the rest in fragments. A vendor who never followed up. A business arrangement quietly dissolved. Plans revised downward without announcement. The kind of changes people don't post about. They moved forward, just not the way they'd imagined. I didn't celebrate any of it. I went back to my routines. Morning coffee. Work I still enjoyed doing because it was mine by choice, not obligation. Long walks where my phone stayed in my pocket instead of dictating my pace. The absence of noise was noticeable, not lonely, clean. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten. Careful. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It didn't ask for money. It didn't ask for help. It acknowledged the text, not indirectly, not vaguely, directly. It said sending it had been wrong, that it had been driven by pressure, by fear of conflict, by the belief that things would smooth over the way they always had. It admitted that they had never expected me to respond the way I did. That line stood out, not because it was insulting, because it was honest. They had believed my boundaries were theoretical, conditional, that I would absorb discomfort because I always had. The letter ended by saying the fallout had been painful but clarifying, that losing access forced them to confront how much of their stability had come from assumption instead of effort. I read it twice, then I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. I wrote back a short response. I said I loved them. I said I hoped they would build something that didn't depend on excluding people while expecting their support. I didn't offer assistance. I didn't reopen accounts. I didn't suggest future arrangements. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to stay closed. Time passed. Holidays came and went. Invitations didn't. Neither did guilt. I stopped waiting for reconciliation. I stopped wondering what version of me was being discussed somewhere else. I knew who I was. Someone who listened when told where he stood. Someone who didn't argue with instructions. Someone who no longer financed disrespect. People like to label this kind of ending revenge. It isn't. Revenge is emotional, loud, temporary. What I did was structural. I accepted the information I was given, then I adjusted my involvement to match it. Emotionally, financially, completely. That's not cruelty, that's alignment. If someone tells you not to come to a wedding you're paying for because you're not wanted, the worst thing you can do is pretend you didn't hear them. The best thing you can do is make sure every part of your life reflects that truth. I did. And the peace that followed wasn't fragile. It didn't depend on apologies or promises or changed moods. It came from knowing I hadn't betrayed myself to keep access to people who had already decided where I belonged. I didn't lose a relationship that day. I lost an illusion, and what replaced it was far more solid. Self-respect. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.